Good evening, everyone. Tonight's talk will be based on an essay which I wrote recently and which will appear in the third section entitled Decentering Human Perception, Art in a Shared Environment, third section of a forthcoming book published by Routledge next spring, called British Art and the Environment and co-edited by our two colleagues, Charlotte Gould and Sophie Mespled, with an afterword by Stephen Daniels. And I'm particularly grateful to Charlotte and Sophie for giving me the opportunity to work on this topic and for, of course, accepting my essay in their book. In a recent article published in the London Review of Books, Catherine Rundell wrote about the rich legendary history of hares in Celtic folklore as much as in the English countryside. And she ended up lamenting that 80% of them had disappeared in the past 100 years due to the radical modification of the landscape and the elimination of the country's no less legendary hedgerows. Now, already in the mid-19th century, two hares had famously tried to run away from it all. Lewis Carroll's white hare, or white rabbit, sorry for the distinction, hounded by the pressure of time, precipitated Alice's innocence down the rabbit hole. While 20 years earlier, J.M.W. Turner's tiny brown hare dashed away from the locomotive of progress in the artist's famous painting, Rain, Steam and Speed of 1844, held by the National Gallery in London. Hare before, trouble behind, says the Celtic legend, and that same year, in 1844, the poet Wordsworth wrote a poem entitled On the Projected Candle and Windermere Railway, which begins thus. Is then no nook of English ground secure from rash assault? Schemes of retirement sown in youth and mid the busy world kept pure, as when their earliest flowers of hope were blown, must perish? How can they this blight endure? Turner's awareness of the profound changes affecting the world he experienced with such intensity is evidence in several of his pictures on a wide spectrum of registers, from blinding fascination to darkest anguish. In The Fighting Temeraire Tugged to Her Last Berth to be Broken Up, 1838, the old warship and the world before, as it were, which it heroically represented, although the nature of that heroism too was already being questioned, all those are made to look obsolescent by the absence of the sails and the presence of the dark, fiery tugboat. The magnificent light that irradiates the whole right side of the canvas is that of a setting sun, ready to leave the stage to the white cold moon above the boats. With keelmen heaving in coals by moonlight of 1835, held by the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Turner uses sharp contrasts of darkness and luminescence to depict the somber, dehumanizing realities of the soaring demand for coal, resulting from the new pressures of the Industrial Revolution, with its ghostly human shadows caught between the dark smoke and the orange and white glare of the torches on the right side of the canvas. Earlier in his career, in Limekiln at Colebrook Dale of 1797, held by the Yale Center for British Art, Turner had already offered the remarkably dark depiction of a local small-scale kiln, ominously suggestive of the disturbance of natural rhythms caused by non-stop industrial activity. Turner was not the only artist to register the contemporary changes. Philippe de Loutherbourg's own depiction of the Madley wood furnaces owned by the Coal-Brookdale Company from 1776 to 1796 amplifies Turner's chiaroscuro effects into a full blaze, hellish scene in which fire and smoke alter the surrounding landscape, thus creating a disturbing daylight impression in the heart of the night. Equally iconic of the Industrial Revolution's early visualizations are Joseph Wright of Derby's two paintings, Arkwright's Cotton Mills by Night of 1782 and Arkwright's Mills of 1795-96, which show from a fair distance the newly implanted 6- and 7-story brick buildings of the factories, harmoniously niched in the heart of a most attractive countryside. Now, Wright was a friend of Arkwright's, whose portrait he painted several times. And Joseph Wright of Derby was also very close or in close proximity with the members of the Lunar Society, which included Arkwright, and he showed Wright great interest in the new discoveries of science and technology, and was actually very familiar with the story that led from Arkwright's development of a new spinning machine to the setting up of huge water-powered factories and, in effect, the beginning of the factory system. Wright's two paintings of the mills, By Day and By Night, are unmistakably picturesque and do not seem to suggest that one of Britain's most gifted and independent landscape painters felt or wished to represent a potential disruption of nature. Yet, as Jonathan Crary has recently suggested, while Wright could not have registered changes in the landscape, which in any case were not perceptible for quite a few other decades, his night scene is, I quote, unsettling in its elaboration of a nocturnal scene in which the light of the full moon, illuminating a cloud-filled sky, coexists with the pinpoints of windows lit by gas lamps in the cotton mills. The artificial lighting of the factories announces the rationalized deployment of an abstract relation between time and work, severed from the cyclical temporalities of lunar and solar movements. Arkwright's mills conveys the physical proximity of these two spheres, one natural, one invented, and also a sense of incommensurability and fatal incompatibility. In the same vein, in a note dictated to Isabella Fenwick in relation to his writing of The Excursion, Wordsworth used the strongly damning adjective unnatural to allude to the factory system. Parliament has interfered to prevent the night work which was carried on in these mills as actively as during the daytime, and by necessity, still more perniciously. A sad disgrace to the proprietors and to the nation, which could so long tolerate such unnatural proceedings. Now, the reception and interpretation of all such images has long been the subject of debate and occasional controversies, then as much as now. First, as Andrea Gaynor and Ian MacLean remind us, the artistic bias of such visual material has often led, simplistically I would say, to its wholesale rejection as evidence. It is by no means obvious that fine art can be a reliable source of empirical, ecological, or other data. The conventional impediment to using fine art as evidence for anything other than the artist's state of mind or ideological inclinations is its aesthetic function. For example, its inclination to flatter or prefer the picturesque. Art is second-hand information that is self-consciously representational, aesthetically organized, often expressionistic and inherently open to multiple interpretations. However, fine art also provides an enormous file of pictorial information from the past that, before the widespread use of photography, is not available pictorially anywhere else. And so its potential as a source of historical information is enormous. This is particularly the case with the Western landscape genre, because it was closely affiliated with the more didactic concerns of Western art and science, and was closely aligned to the topographic tradition. As recent studies have shown, the chromatic intensity of sunlight in landscape paintings can, for instance, provide valuable environmental information on past air pollution. Turner's recourse to saturated glares and glows, often found repulsive by his contemporaries, is now directly linked to his exceptional sensitivity to atmospheric phenomena and to his experimental attempts at rendering them with pigment, way beyond the common understanding of that topographic tradition mentioned by Gaylor and MacLean. Now, of course, the very issue of topography itself, in its opposition to imaginative landscape art, also has a rich history. And this is the second reason why such material is complex. The debate, at a time when science and art were indeed often seen as complementary enterprises, and you remember that between 1780 and 1837, the Royal Academy and the Royal Society, in other words, the Academy of Art and the Academy of Science, were both housed in the Strand wing of Somerset House, with their boardrooms on either side of the same wall. So the debate about topography turns around two questions: whether the depiction of nature and landscapes by artists was a worthy endeavor, and whether such iconography in any way enriched our, to quote Reynolds, our knowledge of what is truly nature. This phrase by Reynolds is his definition of art theory, and he painted an allegory of theory on the ceiling of the Royal Academy's library with this phrase, knowledge, the knowledge of what is truly nature. Art is the knowledge of what is truly nature. Now, the complexity of the questioning was most often simplified or polarized to take the form of a binary opposition. In other words, should landscape representations be considered as factual evidence or as creative art? As Sam Smiles writes, serious landscape artists of this period were wary of being seen as mere transcribers of the external world, producing an entirely servile and commonplace art. Landscape needed to fight its corner within academic theory, and its ablest practitioners were adept at renegotiating its position in art criticism and expanding its field of operations. The most often quoted statement of the period is Henry Fuseli's development about it in his Royal Academy lecture on invention, when he criticized, I quote, the kind of landscape which is entirely occupied with the tame delineation of a given spot, an enumeration of hill and dale, clumps of trees, shrubs, water, meadows, cottages and houses, what is commonly called views. These, if not assisted by nature, dictated by taste, or chosen for character, may delight the owner of the acres they enclose, the inhabitants of the spot, perhaps the antiquary or the traveler, but to every other eye, they are little more than topography. The landscape of Titian, of Mola, or Salvator, of the Poussins, Claude, Rubens, Elsheimer, Rembrandt, and Wilson spurns all relation with this kind of map work. Yet, as Martin Myrone reminds us, and as recent scholarship on British landscape art has explored, the issue was both richer and more complex. Even as the opposition of topographical imagery to art was set out seminally in the early 19th century, and by Fuseli most influentially, the possibilities for a much more productive confusion of categories was being actively entertained for personal, professional, and commercial reasons. This, at least, is what becomes clear when the range of media and contexts addressed by historians of landscape art is expanded sufficiently to include topographers and map makers, as well as canonical figures like Turner and Constable. An issue which another great English art historian, John Barrell, has addressed in similar terms. There was in the 18th century a variety of landscape called topography, sometimes strict topography, which was committed to the accurate recording of particular places. Eventually, however, in the early 19th century, topographical art was transcended by something infinitely more serious and more powerful, a sublime style of painting that sought to represent grandeur of nature and to produce in us feelings of awe, fear, or horror. What in the late 18th century had been understood as a distinction between the picturesque and the unpicturesque took on a more elevated, distinctly romantic dimension when the difference became one of moral and aesthetic elevation and sophistication. Whether the subject and location of the picture were actually recognizable or not ceased to be of central importance. In the articles he wrote in 1823 and 24 for the Somerset House Gazette and Literary Museum, articles published under the title of, I quote, "The Rise and Progress of Watercolor Painting in England," William Henry Pine suggested that topographical images did indeed respond to the increasing demand from country house owners and antiquarians, but that this did not mean either that they lacked artistic interest or that artistic landscape views should not be topographical. In his first article, which discusses the compared merits of Girtin and Turner and how they surpassed all their predecessors in the genre, it is all a question of, quote, superior feeling, which is in no way detrimental to the truth of the depiction. A third and last reason why the interpretation of late 18th and early 19th century landscape can be difficult is the period's ambivalent response to the development of the mechanical industry and its consequences. In 1835, Scottish chemist and business theorist Andrew Ure could write that Providence has assigned to man the glorious function of vastly improving the productions of nature by judicious culture and of working them up into objects of comfort and elegance with the least possible expenditure of human labor, an undeniable position which forms the basis of our factory system. Conversely, 6 years earlier, the poet Robert Southey, in his more radical moments, denounced the evils of the new factory system as, I quote, a wen, a fungus excrescence from the body politic. The growth might have been checked if the consequences were apprehended in time, but now it has acquired so great a bulk, its nerves have branched so widely, and the vessels of the tumor are so inoculated into some of the principal veins and arteries of the natural system, that to remove it by absorption is impossible, and excision will be fatal. And what attracts me in this quotation, of course, is in the last segment, which hinges on the idea of the irreversibility of what is going on. I'll come back to that later when we talk about the Anthropocene. While the observational pregnance and modernity of British landscape art, and that of Constable and Turner in particular, are indisputable, its expression of any form of conscious or intuitive ecological concerns and its relevance as historical evidence within our current global debates primarily require a cautious interdisciplinary re-examination of the works themselves. In book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, entitled Of Systems of Political Economy, published in 1776, Adam Smith, assessing the importance of colonies through a rigorous analysis based on the colonial impact of 300 years, dispassionately suggested that the discovery of the New World not only brought wealth and prosperity to the Old World, but that it also marked a divide in the history of mankind. His vision remained tentatively optimistic. The discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Their consequences have already been very great, but in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries, which has elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. What benefits or what misfortunes to mankind may hereafter result from those great events, no human wisdom can foresee. By uniting in some measure the most distant parts of the world, by enabling them to relieve one another's wants, to increase one another's enjoyments, and to encourage one another's industry, their general tendency would seem to be beneficial. Recent research has indeed proposed, not to everyone's approval, that the start of the Anthropocene could be dated to the discovery of the Americas and the establishment of colonization, understood as the starting point of man's ruthless conquest of the world. The Holocene, which began about 12,000 years ago, towards the end of the Ice Age, and which encompassed almost the entire history of the human race, was defined as a period of relative climatic stability, allowing the flourishing of life. The Anthropocene is defined by the action of anthropos, human beings, shaping or reshaping the earth on a global scale. With the coincidental publication in 1776 of the Declaration of Independence and of the Wealth of Nations, the political and economic relations of empire and mercantilism, of human and soil exploitation, were canonized as the tenets of the new secular Bible of the Western world, so that historians have often designated 1776 as the turning point in modern history. Meanwhile, the growing importance of ecological concerns and its transcription into the new discipline of ecocriticism have, more pragmatically and visibly, identified the first half of the 19th century as a convincing starting point of the Anthropocene, a period when the profound effects of the two industrial revolutions could be felt and seen, when man's imprint upon nature became primordial and seemed both essential and irreversible. Indeed, the second half of the 19th century witnessed the transformations caused by the first industrial revolution and their harmful consequences. Problems reached unprecedented scales, whole countrysides losing their population and becoming empty, the growing meaninglessness of work, the division of tasks, the rationalization and acceleration of production, the emergence of the concept of alienation, with masses of people piling up in unhealthy peripheries, pollutions multiplying, the lack of hygiene, ugliness. Tech means now at the disposal of man were becoming scary. Distances were artificially reduced. The stranglehold of civilization was gaining all territories. Artists and theorists like William Morris and John Ruskin famously reacted by taking a political stance that inspired the arts and crafts movement from the 1860s onwards. Environmental science and thought, which began to structure themselves with Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species of 1859, and the invention of the term ecology in 1866 by Darwin's disciple Ernst Haeckel, gradually gave rise, in addition to the study of complex and dynamic interrelationships within ecosystems, gave rise to philosophical new questionings about the place of man in nature and the features and consequences of their plural impact over it. The sharp awareness of nature and the profound transformation it was undergoing are already perceptible in the art and literature of the early 19th century in England. Unrelated to the Anthropocene, the subject has often been identified and discussed in the poetry of the period, from the early premonitory signs of unease and nostalgia found in the works of William Collins, Thomas Gray, and the so-called graveyard poets, to the bitter and desperate pastoral vision of George Crabbe, and of course, the importance of recollection and of a pre-lapsarian childhood vision in Wordsworth, whose poems often express grief and regret for the loss of natural innocence and spontaneity, for the way the materialistic world of consumerism and industry has distanced man from nature and thus somehow perturbed the essential harmony present in the order of nature. In the early days of what has been called romantic eco-criticism, Jonathan Bate, in his classic opus Romantic Ecology, strongly advocated a new endorsement of Wordsworth's way of looking at nature. If one historicizes the idea of an ecological viewpoint, one finds oneself squarely in the Romantic tradition. More recent critical approaches, responding to contemporary urgency of climate change and Anthropocenic thinking, have called for a more cautious handling of this romantic material. In his recent survey of the question, Jeremy Davies acknowledges the fact that romantic authors did undoubtedly react to the modifications of local, and in the context of the French Revolution, of colonial trade and of the Napoleonic era global as much as local, modifications of local and global ecosystems, thus making the British Romantic period, of course, a particularly relevant one within the environmental humanities. Yet, Davies warns, it is easy to sympathize with recent idealist eco-critics' desire to justify the scholarly enterprise by specifying Romanticism's contemporary relevance or to find inspiration for an environmental agenda in celebrated literary works. A deeper trust that literary study is worthwhile, however, means being at ease with the likelihood that there will be few perfect coincidences of opinion between Romantic period writers and 21st century environmentalists. Idealist eco-criticism has now too often become a way of reading that simply imposes upon Romantic writings the assertion that they foreshadow, intuit, or preview the critic's own views about environmental issues. If a form of environmental awareness is undeniably an important streak in Romantic English poetry, and it is also deeply present in Byron, for instance, the same issues and questionings equally apply to the remarkable coincidence in Britain of the industrial revolutions with the triumph of landscape as the highest pictorial genre in the English School of Art. This coincidence and this awareness have led to the emergence of what has recently been called the Anthropocenic, with an S before the C, a concept put forward primarily by David Matles, who is a professor of cultural geography at the University of Nottingham. Now, in this essay and other works, David Matles is not primarily concerned with Romantic landscape art, but his approach is definitely fruitful when we consider that Constable's and Turner's works were actually produced in the same years, not only as the poetry of Wordsworth and Byron, but also as Percy Bysshe Shelley's four-act lyrical drama Prometheus Unbound and Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus of 1818, two works which, beyond their obviously different engagements with the issue of man's free will and creative energy, seem to evince a similar concern with the consequences of unchecked or augmented human power and industry, evidenced by the recent political and technological revolutions. Now, it seems to me that the intriguingly abundant production of landscape art in Britain can also be fruitfully and symptomatically looked at within this Anthropocenic context or perspective. Landscape is a construction. Landscape is a built gaze. It is, as it were, nature touched by men who look at it or into it to find their own traces. In the words of Dennis Cosgrove and Stephen Daniels, it is, I quote, a cultural image, a pictorial way of representing, structuring, or symbolizing surroundings. This is in their well-known volume called Iconography of Landscape. To walk in the landscape is to walk in history. To look at landscape is to examine the traces and imprint of that history. The appearance and encroachment of new visible elements in the landscape, like industrial buildings or infrastructures, bridges, roads, canals, and the variety of their related consequences, like land divisions or air pollution, brought about a new set of visual traces which we find in those works. As Jeremy Davies has put it, most modern economic historians credit the Romantic period with a pivotal role in a socio-economic transformation that proved to be of global consequence. Those historians explore fundamental changes in the way that British society metabolized human labor and the non-human world between the 1770s and the 1840s, that is to say, the apex of landscape production in England, landscape art production. These new traces did not escape the eye of the contemporary artists who had to reconcile their conventional apprehension of landscape, informed by strict classical and academic aesthetic rules or tenets, to reconcile those with the incorporation of these unexpected novel objects appearing here and there and gradually perturbing the scene. In a letter to John Fisher of 1821, Constable wrote, "Painting is with me but another word for feeling." With Turner and Constable, as remarkable English empiricists, landscape became a terrain of experiments. In each and every work, the sensorial experience, conveyed by texture, light, and matter, is a revealer of the human experience and of our existence in or coexistence with the nature that surrounds us, a nature to which somehow we belong. And perhaps we could say that the main subject of landscape art, as Constable and Turner for the first time conceived it, the main subject of landscape art is an acknowledgement and exploration of this somehow, our somehow belonging to nature, an exploration of this frictional inscription of man's presence, a momentous reclassification of the landscape genre, which endowed it with such remarkable philosophical and epistemological force that, in their eyes at least, landscape art could be seen as modernity's new form of history painting. As Sam Smiles puts it, as the possibilities for landscape in England moved from producing a topographical record to providing a vehicle for the full play of the artistic imagination, so landscape arrogated to itself some of the intellectual, ethical, and spiritual concerns that had been traditionally associated with history painting alone. The privatization of open fields and the division of land into enclosed patches, materialized by the raising of fences, are mostly absent from representations of the landscape, even though, surprisingly, the enclosure movement was soon perceived as a denaturation of the landscape. In Mousehold Heath, Norwich of 1818, John Crome does not represent the changes in the landscape, even though the heath had been fully enclosed by 1814 and turned into arable land. However, perhaps the figure on the right seems to point an accusing finger at the newly plowed inroads which scar the landscape, and the heath has clearly all but disappeared. Remember that 2,500 enclosure acts were passed by Parliament between 1762 and 1844. It seems clear, however, that while neither Constable nor Turner were after topographical accuracy in such a literal sense, they engaged repeatedly and richly with the liminal issue of the frame at the heart of their respective enterprises. Indeed, both artists, in their different approaches, soon realized the challenge they faced in having to grapple with the very problematic challenge of framing the landscape, or enclosing it, if you prefer, framing the landscape, which cannot but have seemed to be a real contradiction in terms, when their very project was to represent the boundlessness and truth of nature. Their response to this difficulty came through an incessant experimentation in formats, in mediums, in textures, in the very repetition of subjects, in the new currency given to the sketch or the preparatory work, as can be seen, for instance, in Constable's numerous cloud studies or his 6-foot oil sketches, or in Turner's recurrent depictions of a selection of ruined castles. A compulsive experimentation, an endless search for visual vibrancy and variety, for an exploration of limits, which, it seems to me, was meant precisely to disturb or perturb the frame. The year when Mary Shelley published her Frankenstein in 1818, at the annual exhibition of the Royal Academy of Arts in London, Turner, then at the peak of his public career, presented, strangely, 3 large oil paintings in strikingly contrasting styles, which could easily have been submitted by 3 different artists. First, a seascape, Dort or Dordrecht, the Dort packet boat Becalmed, owned by the Yale Center for British Art, a magnificently luminous tribute to the Dutch painter Albrecht Cuyp, who was born in Dordrecht. This was one of Turner's favorite paintings, and it contains and combines several essential elements of his grammar. First, like London or Venice, which are so prominent in his work, Dordrecht is a port city, a place of constant exchange and movement. Incidentally, the packet boat, which gave the French word paquebot, the packet boat was a postal vessel which crossed the North Sea several times a week. From the earliest records of history, ports have been vital points of contact between man and sea, places of prosperity and tragedy, which have recorded the historical fluctuations of the interdependence between human activity and maritime forces. Turner insists here on the peaceful character of the small daily routines, like the eggs and vegetables offered by the villagers to the passengers. Meanwhile, the sea, another strong element in Turner's thematic grammar, the sea is the place of all reflections, the dramatic theater of nature's forces, on whose stage the ship, here becalmed, draws its majesty from crossings experience or storms yet to come. Dominating the scene and the canvas, the bipolar warm and cold hues of the northern sky are a tribute to those Dutch landscapists, Cuyp, of course, but also Berchem, Ruysdael, or Hobbema, whom Turner admired so much, probably because, like them, he would attempt all his life, with very organic texture of his skies, to render the countless and capricious movements of the elemental forces of light, air, and water. Here is a painting by Cuyp. Unusually so, in Turner's career, this luminous painting was praised unanimously. The Morning Chronicle described it as, I quote, one of the most magnificent paintings ever exhibited, which is a tribute to our time. While Constable, who knew what he was talking about, spoke of, I quote, the most complete work of genius I have ever seen. The second painting Turner exhibited that year, Raby Castle, the seat of the Earl of Darlington, looks indeed like some topographical landscape depicting a property in the north of England. The painting was commissioned by its owner, the Earl of Darlington, whose fox hunting party, fox hunting was the ancient aristocratic country pastime par excellence. The Earl's fox hunting party can be seen crossing the dark plain like a transient comma. In the center of the picture, somehow between heaven and earth, the castle itself appears behind a curtain of trees, a distant marker of history and of human presence, whose tiny crenellated battlements are discreetly, almost ironically echoed in the cloud above. Built on land that once belonged to the Viking king Canute the Great in the 11th century, the castle was first owned by the Neville family, who played such a prominent role in the history of the English monarchy in the 13th and 14th centuries, before being acquired in the 17th century by the Barnard family, to which it still belongs. Turner was often thus commissioned and fed by great English families to represent their family seats. Shortly before his visit to Raby Castle, the whole domain, like so many others around the country, had been landscaped into a park, the rigors of history fading in favor of a natural and cultivated lifestyle within an English countryside transformed into a new Garden of Eden at a time when Britain was becoming the center of the world. Turner, as in all his English scenes, is here interested in the vanishing traces of the nation's history. Animated by the same high ambitions as his contemporary John Constable, he endowed landscape painting through unusual subjects and noticeably large formats with a new status in European art. The main subject of the painting is primarily pictorial. The meditation on the fleeting nature of the vicissitudes of history is here expressed through the restless interplay of wind and clouds that alternately lighten and darken the surrounding countryside, in which castle and hunters ultimately come across as almost insignificant details. The third picture, exhibited in 1818, The Field of Waterloo, can truly be called a modern history painting. It is a nightmarish nocturne in which the pale moon and the survivors' torches combine to reveal piles of corpses and the horrors of war, which no night ever will manage to erase. Friend, foe, in one red burial blent, Byron had written in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, a line Turner added to the painting's title in the catalogue entry. The year before, during a trip to Flanders, Turner had visited the famous battlefield, which still kept many traces of the massacre, and the feverish notes he took on the occasion betray the emotion of the visionary artist who suddenly realized, like the poet, the local and global consequences of this event and deeply felt the tragically futile character of those undifferentiated human losses. As so often in his work, Turner here translates the intensity of human tragedies in a pictorial idiom that evokes Rembrandt, but also all the iconography of Old Testament massacres and disasters, a genre to which he himself contributed several paintings. Waterloo is represented as the apocalyptic culmination of the Napoleonic saga, while to all European conservatives, the French emperor's defeat felt like a beneficial and necessary purging. In Turner's vision, it primarily reads like a bad anthropocenic omen for all new empire builders, notably, at the dawn of the Victorian era, all the adepts of the Rule Britannia principle. Needless to say, the painting was very badly received in London. Pictured in a deadly pale and frontal light, incidentally, Turner, defying the academic rules of harmonious composition, very often depicts light frontally, surrounded by acrid and morbid smoke. Humanity is here depicted as no more than a magma of rotten flesh, and nature is ravaged. The three paintings have roughly the same format, therefore the contrast between them is all the more striking, particularly in terms of color, tones, and light. As a group, interestingly, they seem to illustrate the three aesthetic categories of the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublime, so much discussed at the time. And their simultaneous exhibition in 1818 by a unanimously admired Turner, in full possession of his artistic faculties, cannot have been accidental and could perhaps suggest that they form a set of declarative recordings of man's footprint. The three of them are discretely structured by an ascending diagonal starting from the lower right-hand corner, and seem as a group to try and make a joint statement of intent. Right when the fall of Napoleon was leaving the field open to the rise of the British Empire, Turner chose the Royal Academy's annual exhibition, now the center of the European art world, to show some of his experiments in the landscape genre, which ambitioned to be considered as history paintings, thus endowing this highly valued academic genre with a new modern currency. Evidencing a remarkable sensitivity to the passing of time, be it historical or atmospheric, perceiving some sense in each and every reflection, Turner has entrusted light and color, rather than with the task of showing and reflecting the nature of human destiny. What Constable's and Turner's works allow us to see is the extent to which they repeatedly address the issue of man's occupation, construction, and colonization of nature, and how they visually articulate and reconsider to that purpose notions like the natural, the wild, the inhabited, etc. In their pictures, most human figures and buildings occupy only a small portion of the canvas. Human presence, however inconspicuous, is explored in its tentative, peaceful, or brutal conversation with the natural world. But quite strikingly, that natural world is never considered as man's environment, something as it were peripheral, surrounding man's central presence. Here, nature is the center and has become, or is restored as, the dominating force. This subtle displacement of what is central, of what matters between man and nature, is, to my mind, the main revolution introduced by the English landscapists of the period, who replaced the centrality of man and of man's control over nature, which was the main characteristic of classical history painting, but which was also the main tenet of colonialism. They replaced the centrality of man with the extraordinary symphonic force with which they endowed nature in the real scenes they depicted. 19th century landscape art thus reflects the demise of Christian theological and classical cosmologies and the rise of new cosmologies in which nature and not the human subject is the touchstone of truth. Increasingly, European landscape painting showed a world shaped by the environmental interaction of natural things, forces and climates, rather than divine decree or human reason, as if a moral order could be discerned in nature itself. It seems therefore, and I will finish there, it seems therefore increasingly possible and perhaps necessary to look at the landscape art of the British Romantic period as evidence, to consider the very profusion of landscape pictures. Just to remind you, the Turner bequest, the gift he made to the English nation of all his works, his bequest comprised 300 oil paintings, but also 30,000 sketches, watercolors, and images of any kind. So consider the very profusion of landscape pictures designed in the same years as the Industrial Revolutions as the symptom of an anguished urgency to record that evidence, to re-explore the images themselves as containing the first traces of what it is we have done to nature ever since. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting us to look at these scenes of nature as signs of man, as Tony Tanner would have said apropos of America. Thank you also for this compelling proposition to read landscape painting as history painting. And I'm sure there are questions among the audience.
Which I will be happy to answer in French or in English, of course.
Thank you.
Whichever is easier and more comfortable.
So yes, to ask a question, please maybe use if you can use the hand on your screen. I think that would be good. I can start with a comment. I was struck by two tropes that you have underlined, the ruins and the battleground. So the ruins as a maybe, I mean, the vanishing trace of the human and the dream and illusion, no doubt, of getting back to nature, and the battlefield as maybe the human footprint on nature. And we know that wars fought on that scale indeed had what we could call today an ecological footprint. So this is not really a question, but a remark on these two forms of ruins, maybe those of castles, buildings, and those of bodies who become picturesque testimonies of the Anthropocene, the castles, and on the other hand, the bodies that maybe are a sort of symptom of the tragic traces of the Anthropocene.
Thank you. That's a very, very shrewd remark. I cannot but agree with that. Of course, yes, definitely. There is in the ruins phenomenon, I mean, this is a chapter by itself, ruins in the 18th century and their inclusion in landscape gardens and their picturesqueness and so on and so forth is a well-known topic. But there is definitely in the inbuilt movement of ruins, the idea that nature will always creep back. But of course, when you think in Anthropocenic terms, there comes a point when you actually begin to wonder whether nature will be able to creep back, and whether it is not now become a battlefield in which nothing else will ever grow.
Yes, yes, thank you very much. So, Graham Whittington. If you can reactivate your microphone. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for all those ideas. Obviously, I'm going to, you know me, so you know I'm going to go off at a tangent. Two little things and one larger subject. When I wrote down very obediently your definition of Anthropocene, human beings reshaping the earth on a global scale, the first thing I thought of was Robinson Crusoe, which is much earlier. And my reading of the end of Robinson Crusoe is that things will never be the same again there. Second little point, but again about something that happens earlier. Before the move into the city and all that horrible urban pollution that you showed, there was an earlier sort of ecological movement where workshops were set up alongside rivers in Lancashire, Yorkshire, and there were many complaints that the water mills changed the flow and therefore affected agriculture, and also that people who were dyeing wool poured nasty colours into the rivers. So I think there is a sort of earlier ecological awareness there, which I at least see in Blake's Songs of Innocence as well, where there's a very close relationship with nature. But the larger thing that I wanted to say is about, and this won't surprise you, Fred, about childhood and the child. Not being an expert on exactly what romantic ecology is, I would be prepared to argue at great length, if we had longer, that the child in the late 18th century is an ecological battleground, and that if you look, as I've been doing very recently, at advice given, the books of advice for parents on how to raise their children, the debate is all about, leaving fortunately Rousseau aside, the debate is about the words that you used about nature, the natural, the wild. And for me, these subjects that you see quite frankly in Turner and in Constable, for me, they're present earlier in the way people look at the child. And just as a sort of bracket, Constable's fixation on the house where he is born, to me, also has a part of that in it, because he keeps going back to that and the way it changes over time. And for me, that's part of my definition, which is probably the wrong one, of ecology. And then the final thing I wanted to say was that what you said at the beginning about can we believe what we see, the evidence and so on, where I am at the moment on all these books of advice on parenting is they don't actually tell us anything about children in the 18th century, but they tell us a lot about the attitudes of the people who wrote books of advice on parenting. So I think that's a very important point. You know, what do we trust? So what really I'm arguing in all the little points and the big point is, one, there are hints of all this well before, which sometimes go underground and then reappear.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Graham. Just before I not answer but react to your points, do you mind if I introduce you to the rest of the group? Just to say that Graham submitted a wonderful doctorate thesis at Charles V some time ago, and It was before I was at Charles V and Paris 7, and I had the privilege of sitting on the jury, and it was my first jury ever, and I was probably younger than you and knew far less about the topic than you did, but I remember that it was a wonderful piece of work on precisely some of the issues that we've been discussing and that you've brought back into the discussion, in particular, of course, the importance of childhood innocence as first a reality, but also a metaphor for other concerns. You're right that in a way, when you develop this Anthropocenic disease, you start finding signs or premonitions or inklings of it here and there. And it's interesting to see how specialists and scientists keep disagreeing on when to decide to start the Anthropocene as an era, because they all come with very convincing evidence that in the Middle Ages or in Rome or in the 17th century, they all have their good points of start. And so Robinson Crusoe is definitely one of them. And not only Robinson Crusoe, but all the Robinsonade that followed and which kept the myth alive are obviously concerned with a lot of the things I have been discussing, which is mostly man's footprint. And literally in Robinson Crusoe, there are scenes of man's footprint, which are very famous. So thank you very much for bringing this back into the debate. As for the water mills by the rivers and the dying colors thrown into the water, yes, I'm familiar with all this material. I just didn't have time to bring it into the picture. But it is, yeah, there are great debates at the time and ecological concerns about this destruction of the landscape by the mills. So thank you very much. You very briefly mentioned Blake, who could certainly have had a little part to play in my talk, but again, I didn't have time and I didn't want to do Blake quickly, so I left him out. Sorry, William.
And I think you are still younger than me, and though you now know more than me, so you have done well there. That Blake also has those monumental paintings of ecological disasters as well. Yeah.
Thomas? Good to see you.
Very good to see you, Frédéric. I have a technical problem. I'm not going to be able to ask the question. I'll try to resolve it first.
Okay.
I'm going to send it as a chat.
Okay. Sandeep?
Sorry, I'll let Thomas do it first.
Thomas is going to write it down because he has a technical problem.
All right. Thank you. Sorry, there goes the question. I can come in later. That's all right.
Let me look at it then. I'll just read very one. You remarked early on that this land has a sort of topography.
I'm not sure if this is working now. Frédéric, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
I can hear you very well. Okay. So I was just wondering, like, is there, to put the question in the most simple way, can you see in the art that you know so well, a positive way to put it as simply as this, in which these artists see the human footprint. I mean, is the human footprint, I mean, these are such beautiful paintings, such moving paintings. Is the human footprint only seen as destructive? Maybe too simple as a question.
Your question, obviously not. No, obviously not. And I could have done exactly the same talk with only positive pictures, positive landscapes.
Yeah.
So you're perfectly right. Of course, the discourse about nature and its representation are eminently ambivalent. What I focused upon are tremors or signs of anxiety, which are not present in every work. Mm-hmm. Just as a non-answer to your great question, because obviously this would need another panel to balance my act. Just to add this little bit of information, the origin of this talk came from my puzzlement at something which has never been discussed, as far as I know, anywhere, which is the incredible number of landscape paintings that we get of that period. You can find millions of books telling you how great they are, how wonderful, how sophisticated, how watercolor is different from oil or whatever. But there is nothing on the sheer quantity, the volume, the bulk. And so I tried to think about it, and I decided to interpret that as a kind of symptom of something, kind of urge to do quickly and a lot something that might go.
And
but
to reverse enclosure. It seemed like you were to give a reverse to enclosure, an expansion, but not necessarily expansion as global, taking over the planet. Thank you. No, thank you very, very much. I really, really enjoyed this talk, but I'll let others ask questions.
Sandeep, I think, had a question.
Thank you so much, Frédéric. That was a very fascinating talk, and I actually sat through the whole thing, and now I'm feeling a little nervous about asking these questions because I have a one-track mind, as you might know, and that's about the politics of beauty, the entire landscape movement, and specifically Turner, that we know is also known for the slave ship a little later. So I was just thinking about the beginning of your talk where you mentioned sensing the world, and then you went on to talk about the countryside, the mills, the world. You mentioned, of course, my one-track mind heard it mention of empire. So I'm just wondering, how does empire creep into the colonial countryside? I'm linking this to Corinne Fowler's project of, the Unpleasant Garden that has just come out and which has received a lot of flack from the National Trust. And so she is talking about, of course, the colonial landscape of the 18th century. And I wonder if in your work, you also think about the empire lurking behind this very, Turner politics of beauty, because we know with the slave ship what he wrote, and the last, the poem that accompanied it was, of course, ended on "Where is thy market now?" Specifically talked about a critique of the free market. So in your research, do you find references, or do you think this bleak light represents something else? I don't know. I'm not an expert on landscape painting, but I'm just thinking about, the presentation that you made. You use word empire, the world, the mills, the cotton mills, of course, and the river. So and the sea, the ocean. So if you'd like to comment on this.
I would be very happy to comment on this, even though it's a whole subject by itself. The the relationship between Turner and let's say post-colonial studies or the sort of empire issue is pretty much documented, and there has been quite a lot of work about that. And so I deliberately, even though the two are obviously interconnected, I went the eco-criticism way rather than bring in the other side. But you mentioned the slave ship, which could certainly had found its place in my talk. And you know that for decades, the slave ship has been dismissed by critics or art historians as being inaccurate chronologically, because by the time he painted the work, slavery had been abolished. But of course, we now know, and there have been very recent publications about that, that true, slavery had been abolished, but it was still going on, and it was still going on very actively in several parts of the world, even at the time when Turner was painting. And so whether he was aware of that and was aware that the sort of superstructure of the English state was still very actively trying to keep as much as they could the logic of slavery going on, I don't know, but he doesn't say anything about it, so we won't lend him words. But the people he worked with or spent a lot of time with were definitely involved in that. So I imagine that they did not exclusively discuss architectures and gardens and pigments. From then on, it's conjectural. But you can reread most of the works that I showed today in that particular perspective very efficiently as well. And in effect, I will reconnect the two at some point because they need to be. Really, my stress today was on the ecological anthropocenic concerns, precisely because it was in the environmental humanities brief. But I don't want to suggest that what I didn't say is either not connected or relevant, or, I mean, the moment you start pulling the thread, everything comes. Well, thank you very much.
You did say that. So I was just wanting to hear more about it, but I think you did refer to it. It's not an oversight in any case. Thank you. Thank you so much, Frédéric.
Thank you for your question.
Sarah, I think
Sarah apparently has a question. So she writes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Fred. It's great to see you. And that was a really magical talk to listen to and see. Even on our screens, there was something very cinematic about the whole experience of listening to you, and a really wonderful way to spend the first part of the curfew. So I had a question which was about something you said, which I think may have been a quote, which is the words somehow belonging to nature, the way man somehow belongs to nature. I really love this expression because it's rather tenuous, and it's all about traces and ways in which man constantly tries to somehow translate an experience of being within landscape, being within the world. And my thought was this, is that this somehow belonging to nature is to do with traces and perhaps also things left behind. And I was thinking of a book which came out 20 years ago, in fact, which was about the idea of mess in the 19th century. It was by David Trotter. And it was unfortunately called Cooking with Mud. And so therefore it sort of just vanished a bit because it was put in all the wrong places, cookery section of bookshops. But within it, he tried to look at different types of rubbish, things left around, detritus. And instead of making a book about the dichotomy of order, between order and chaos, in fact, it was a way of looking at different ways in which we leave things behind. And obviously now, I mean, in the present day, we've left too many things behind, and we can't even recycle it because we make too much. And I was wondering if you had a feeling about that, a sensitivity to that way Turner leaves. Often there'll be a fishbone, or there'll be something in the foreground which will somehow speak of people who have left us and walked away. Did you have any feeling about those traces, those scattered small things in the paintings?
I hadn't thought about that, Sarah. Thank you very much for suggesting that. Turner's paintings are full of bizarre things, which have led to all kinds of even more bizarre interpretations. And it's true that there are several pictures, especially some of the very serene watercolors, which are magical. And you find the odd scratch, which some imagine to be the remnants of a tree or the tail of a dog or whatever. But I've never considered them in that light, which would be to consider them as possible litter or human remnants or traces in that sense. But I will go back to the pictures and look at them from that perspective. Concerning the somehow, it seems to me, I mean, it's something that really comes from my own study of landscape gardens and the way from the Grand Siècle Jardin à la Française, which is all about man's domination of nature, to or through the English landscape garden, which is trying to restore the primacy of nature over man's presence. I think this sort of conflict, which is really central to the Enlightenment, I think this conflict led at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, when there was this great romantic enthusiasm for nature, it led to this philosophical questioning of who are we in nature, or what are we? And interestingly, it's quite similar or close, obviously in a much less articulate way, to recent works by people like Philippe Descola, for instance, who have really tried to, from their own ethnological, anthropological studies of populations which have a completely different relationship to trees and nature and plants, etc., to question Western man's very recent decision that he was superior to nature. Mm-hmm. And so there are interesting works around for instance, the Belgian philosopher Vinciane Després, in her books on animals, for instance, also goes in that direction, and in this attempt to, instead of polarizing this question between who wins, trying to suggest much more subtle biological or bioethical continuity between leaves and plants and human beings.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your suggestion. And I'd love to have the reference of the book you mentioned.
Yes, I'll write it. I'll write it down in the chat right now, or I can send it to you as well.
For everyone, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I don't often visit the cookery section in
no.
bookstores. So.
He'd be very upset if he knew I'd said that, I'm sure. I shall write it right now.
Thank you.
I think Marc Poré had a question.
Yes.
Hi, Marc.
Well, hi. Thank you,
Marc.
Frédéric. It's good, so good to see you again.
Yes,
after all those years. Yes, I loved the poise and the expertise with which you delivered this performance, right? It was a performance. I have a very silly question. I can't formulate it. It's very awkward. I was just wondering whether you'd be prepared to see a possible connection between, on the one hand, the disappearance of nature at the hands of man, and on the other, the the disappearance of figuration at the hands of a painter like Turner. That is to say, the emergence of abstraction. I'm sorry, it's a very corny, issue, how the extent to which Turner is or is not abstract, right? Or at least, the suggestion that something is being removed from the subject of the painting, right? And that would be reality or figuration or representation. And would you possibly see a link, right? However tenacious or however flimsy the link between disappearance of nature on the one hand and emergence of something which is an alternative to the kind of mimetic reality of the 19th century. I know this might be stepping away from the issue of ecology. I'm fully aware of this, right? But I was just throwing this at you, knowing that you will have the answer to my vagaries.
That's a very interesting and intriguing question for several reasons. One reason would be that if abstraction is the thing towards which Turner leans at the end of his life, in his sort of the last 2 decades of his career, then he would be an odd man out, because no one else does that, and no one else will do that for quite a while. I'm sure you're familiar with that famous phrase by Mark Rothko, that when he said, "Oh, this Turner guy, he's definitely studied my work." And then he went on to donate a wonderful series of paintings to the Tate in London, as of course a tribute to his own imbibing of late Turner and the way. Your decision that there might be some kind of emergence of an abstraction or a decreasingly descriptive representation, that's a fascinating suggestion, as a kind of mirror effect of the disappearance of nature at the hands of man. In other words, nature disappearing, then its representation fades away into abstract things or shapes or colors or lines. That's very interesting. My only reservation would be that I strongly disagree with this proposition that Turner went abstract at the end of his life. I think that my own contention, and very personal, is that he sort of went back and back to the same subjects and propositions and enterprises to such an extent that he boiled down the essentials of representation to something that was extremely pure. But to my mind, it's the exact opposite of abstraction. It's an attempt to reach the truth of truth, if you like, to reach the very essence of things, of objects, through the sensations, the emotions, etc., rather than through referential descriptions. But I'm sure our two viewpoints could be reconciled, and I will definitely give some thought to your proposition.
Thank you very much.
Beatrice, you had a question? We can't hear you.
Ah.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Ogée, for this very fascinating talk indeed. I really enjoyed every minute of it. Even though I knew the paintings, I was very happy to see them and to hear you discuss them in such a very stimulating way. I wondered if what you see as the concern with the Anthropocene is also observable. What you said was very interesting, the represented elements on the canvases, that is on the representational side. And I wondered if the materials that people like Turner used also embodied this concern, especially the use of bitumen in painting rather than pure colors. What do you think about the use of the media, of the different medium or different media, and how do they, in a way, embody this concern?
Very interesting question, which is, if you remember Mike Lee's biopic movie on Turner, there's a whole section about this interest of Turner for the chemistry of pigments and trying to find new technologies to reach or to widen the spectrum of colors in a way that was unprecedented. This, in a way, ties in with Thomas' question about the fact that there's also a positive side to Turner's perception of modernity. And I think that Turner was far from being an enemy of progress, and he was fascinated, for instance, by photography, and certainly would have loved to become a photographer if he had survived. But we know that he went to a photographer's studio in the last years of his life and spent a lot of time trying to understand the chemistry of it and how it worked and how it functions. So definitely he was interested in that. Now, the link between that and the ravages of industry, to put it simply, I haven't thought about that. I will give it some thought. There was one of Turner's idols was Reynolds. Reynolds, as the austere president of the Royal Academy, the sort of founding father of the English school, but a very, very serious-minded artist and somebody I really think is undervalued and played a prominent part in the development of British art. In any case, Reynolds was a famous experimenter with chemistry and pigments to such an effect that about 2/3 of his paintings today are no longer visible because his experiments went wrong. And so what at the time were spectacular colors in a couple of decades just faded out and disappeared, which is probably why he has a reputation of a rather bland portrait painter whose colors are sort of pastels and boring. But that certainly wasn't the case. So there is a tradition of experimenting with pigments and chemistry, which Turner probably must have remembered and have added some caution as well.
I was wondering why you chose to focus on, I think several times you chose to focus on the term of footprint, both in your definitions of landscape and the Anthropocene and then the Anthropocenic. And I was wondering why, and because I think when you define landscape as a construction, you also refer to the walking experience of the landscape and walking in history, and then you went back to looking, and so I was wondering what this image, which of course is, I mean, it's a frequent image that you use to talk about human footprint, but I was wondering if there was something more to it.
A very good question, and coincidentally, a very pointed question as far as I'm concerned, because one thing I wanted to do, and I haven't done, is to try and link this use of the term footprint with what you just mentioned, which is this great fascination of English Romantic poets for walks and walking nature, walking the landscape, which becomes a kind of active verb. It's not simply walking in the landscape, it really is walking the landscape, and with all the intellectual developments that can follow from this activity. And so linking the two would be a fascinating thing to try and do. I cannot tell you at this stage what this would lead to. Obviously, as you said, I use the term footprint because it is so prevalent in in eco-criticism and discourses on the Anthropocene. But there's much more to be done with footprint in that sense, because it's not synonymous with ravages necessarily. And so there are distinctions here that need to be refined. It just shows how research is constantly work in progress, and that this essay will be a stage towards other developments, definitely. Thank you very much for this, pointing this out.
And Pascal, I think you have a question too.
Yes, I do. Hello.
And Pascal, good to see you again.
Very nice seeing you again. And thank you very much for this very stimulating and rich talk, which, you know, and beautiful as well. I have a question concerning the end of your talk. You said things about Constable and Turner both addressing the issue of man's occupation of nature, and you showed how in his sublime landscapes, Turner effected a displacement of man with, you know, nature really taking center stage. And you mentioned the fact that, you know, the natural world in their representations wasn't environment, but the natural world. And I was wondering about Constable, how that applies, and because he, to my mind, he represented nature very much in many of his paintings through the prism of man's human activity and man's imprint or footprint on the landscape, and you know, for example, even in Hampstead Heath, there's a representation of quarrying and what it, and even though the Heath paintings turn their backs, turn their back on London. So I was wondering about this distinction that you make between environment and nature, especially with regard to Constable's work.
Yes, one of the problems of my talk is to have brought in Constable with the suggestion that Constable and Turner is more or less the same thing, when it is obviously not, and Constable is another talk. I would love to spend some time on some of his pictures, but what I mean to say is that probably even more in Constable than in Turner, the representation of nature include traces of human activity, which are extremely similar to the activities of nature itself, like growing or fading or falling for leaves or flowing for water. There is a sense that ideally, human activity, and that brings us back to Philippe Descola and that sort of development, the idea that human activity can be just one element of nature as a whole, and that human nature is exactly the same as elm nature or snail nature. It's just one activity there. And the two major activities that you find in Constable are churches, but with no clerical or religious overtones, simply the building of the church and its verticality, which has the advantage of linking the underground and the ground to the above ground, like trees, and agriculture. And agriculture in a very old-fashioned sort of way. For instance, there are very intriguing paintings representing farmers collecting hay in the fields in a way that had long been abandoned, and it had become much more mechanized, and there was no need to represent those people like that. So some interpret it as a description of a world that no longer is, a kind of nostalgia. Others want to see in it a description of how hard labor was before mechanization, in a way. how difficult it was, and thank you, there is progress and things will improve. But in any case, his conception of man's presence is, I think, an attempt to suggest a harmony of that human presence within nature as a whole. When figures in Turner's paintings are tiny, are never recognizable, look very insect-like, and seem much more fragile or like parasites almost. So in a way, what you're telling me, and you're absolutely right, is that I should be more careful in bracketing together Constable and Turner, because even though they share similarities and admire each other, and both produce a huge number of works, so that's a similarity. But apart from that, it's true that they have definitely different takes on perhaps the same issue, which I should have shown. But as you remember, my title was Turner, didn't have Constable in the title of my talk, which is unfair to Constable, but I had to make choices.
I wouldn't dream of approaching you with bringing Constable into the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just one, if I may add something, I have in mind one painting by Constable in which he tackles very discreetly, I think, the question of pollution, because very often he doesn't represent it. He goes into, as you said, a more nostalgic approach to British landscape and so on. But in the opening of Waterloo Bridge, which is a late painting, there's the background is and it's a history painting, a modern history painting. The background is occupied by all sorts of chimney smoke, pollution traces, and so it's just to add one small thing. Thank you.
Can I just add, while other people might be thinking about questions or beginning to look for their aperitif, just want to add that among you all, there's a doctoral student of mine, Diane Coppens, who is writing a doctorate, a thesis on really very related issues. And she wrote a wonderful M.De memoir, which was full of ideas. And I want to thank her for some of the suggestions that she made, which gave me to think. And I'm glad that she's now one of us, that she's joined our community, and I look forward to hearing her on similar topics because she's exploring all these things in a much more thorough way than I do. So we started with Graham Whittington, who on whose doctoral jury I was 7 decades ago, and now we talk about Diane, who is the future of all this.
Diane, maybe you, I see you have your hand raised. Maybe you have a question.
Yes, I had a question. Well, thank you for your introduction and for your presentation tonight. I just had a question, considering the works we've seen tonight and all the works you've been studying over the years. What would you say was Turner's overall attitude, considering the changes he was witnessing? Was he nostalgic? Was he accepting the situation? Was he accepting it in a particularly welcoming way, or was he rejecting it? And did his attitude change over the years, considering, well, the number of years he worked?
It's a very good question, because Turner is a remarkably silent artist. He has left us with a few letters who are completely impossible to understand. And his lectures for the Royal Academy are extremely messy. So we are on very unsafe ground here to decide or to understand what he might have thought about not only nature and progress and industry, but also about God and religion and about many other things. And so therefore, as you can imagine, and you're aware of that because you know that corpus as well as I do, critics are very happy to lend him all kinds of ideas about what he must have thought. What is very interesting in your question is to try and identify whether there is a change in his perception of all this that we could trace along his incredibly large production of images. One fact that I didn't mention, but which is probably because it's well known, but which could be perhaps brought back into the discussion, is that he started in an architect's studio. His first work was to do topographical views for an architect. And those views were so good that in fact they sort of overdid it in such a way that he went the Royal Academy way rather than the probably more lucrative at the time topographical architectural direction. But he has a very clear fascination for buildings and for decaying buildings at the beginning of his career, either because he's commissioned to represent them before they fall apart or before renovation or something like that, but also maybe for more personal reasons, because he's interested in this sign of decay, even if he doesn't have anything to think about it, but he finds it visually intriguing and wants to respond to that. I don't think I would be comfortable to step much beyond that, but it would be interesting to take stock of his early interest in topographical views of ruins and of old buildings in general. Well, maybe the time has come to
an end. If I can just say a few things. Thank you, Frédéric Ogée, for your wonderful presentation. Yes. And it reminding me of your wonderful classes. I'm very grateful for them. I still use them now as a teacher. And I'd like to advertise a couple of sessions that are coming up. So actually we have Béatrice Laurent today with us, and she's speaking tomorrow at Victorian Persistence online, and she's giving a paper about water. And the title of her presentation is Of Water and Women in the Victorian Imagination. So we're very excited about that. And I'm also organizing a conference on anthropocentric thinking with Sarah Gould, who's a former student of Frédéric Ogée, and Diane Leblond. And people on this in this group might particularly be interested in David Farris' paper. So he's our keynote on next Thursday. And he's going to be reading from Footprints in Search of Future Fossils. So it's a book in which he imagines the fossils that we'll leave as humans. So I'll just drop a little the link in the chat, and I'll also email the mailing list so people can sign up if they're interested. So I wanted to mention those two events because I think some people might be interested. Cécile, do you want to say a few concluding words?
Well, just thank you all. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Frédéric, for answering them so kindly, and thank you for your talk. I think it's and it's also it's interesting how much we talked about pollution also today, and then we have a forthcoming session on pollution in art coming up, I think in autumn. So thank you all. Have a great night.
In spring.
Oh, it's spring. So yeah.
With
good.
Dan Fintrace, who is here as well.
Great. So thank you all, and hopefully see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frédéric.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Merci bien, Frédéric.